Well, welcome. We'll give everybody about 30 seconds to 45 seconds here before we get started. Appreciate everybody spending your time here today, and wait just a couple seconds here and we'll get started. Got a big group today, which is good. Well, I'm going to go ahead and get started. It's noon exactly Eastern time, so uh, good morning to everybody else in the other time zones. But really glad to have Dr. Heist here to sort of take us through this topic. Many of you know, just do maybe 6-7 minute overview on some of the sort of housekeeping notes and sort of some general propaganda on us, why you're here, and why we hope this session is going to be the who, why, and how of DAFs. I'm Brian Klontz, president of Charitable Solutions. We started this webinar series back during COVID. I thought we'd do it for 3 to 6 months, and here we are now, however many years later. So I think this is our 58th or 59th webinar. We do try to make them as timely and practical as possible. So maybe Dan, if you want to maybe jump ahead one, I'll go through our quick firm propaganda stuff. So existed now for 23 years. Our mission since day one has been to help make charitable gifts happen that otherwise wouldn't. We do that in sort of some odd ways. Even those within the field think they're odd. I think they're odd. But we have sort of 6 buckets of activity. We do have a team of 28 people within Charitable Solutions, more as the core team. And so I'll start maybe top right there, Emergency Assistance Fund Administration. Won't go into that too much. We have I set up a charity in 2009 just to do disaster relief and emergency personal hardship funds, typically for employees. We have about 130 staff on that side and do about 40 to 50,000 grants a year in that space globally. The other thing is what we're doing today, sort of bottom right, is around sort of CE educational activity. We primarily do this for professional advisors, CE, for boards, for staff, for donors. Do maybe 60 to 80 of those each year, primarily around these particular types of content. Then in the middle, we talk about charitable appraisals. So our tagline is, if you can give it to charity, we can appraise it. We have been stumped with a horse donated to a hippotherapy program. Don't do horses, but we primarily do business interests. I have been doing tons and tons and tons of crypto appraisals, and life insurance appraisals are the 2 things that I work on. We got 2 people that just do qualified business appraisals. And then we have a person that does precious metals and coins, which has come up a lot so far this year. And then someone who does tangible personal property around art collectibles, things like that. So anything that requires a qualified appraiser to complete a qualified appraisal, whether that's an outright gift, life income gift, or a estate gift, we have sort of this little niche service around that. And then the 2 primary activities that we focus on, one are charitable gift annuities. So both non-cash assets and charitable gift annuities are the only 2 types of gifts where a charity can lose more money in the worst case scenario than the original gift. So we spend a ton of time sort of in these 2 spaces. Do that in 2 ways for gift annuities. One sort of top middle there is where we do full actuarial analysis, stress testing of pools to be able to identify any potential risks. And also, more importantly, to maximize those residuums. So spend a lot of time in that space. I've had a number of very, very large gift annuities that we've been working on the last 30 days. I think 4 over $3 million. So we're seeing a lot in the large gift annuity space there. So whether or not reinsurance makes sense, partial reinsurance, other ways of mitigating that risk, spend a lot of time there. And then for the full outsourced model, where a charity might say, we don't want to have a gift annuity program, we don't want to keep doing our gift annuity program, we don't have registration in a particular state, or for a particular type of asset, or for a size of gift, or for an age, for any of those reasons, rather than saying no, we have the National Gift Annuity Foundation registered in all 50 states. So any charity on a one-off basis can simply outsource that by referral to the National Gift Annuity Foundation, and then we do all the stuff. So all the compliance and actuarial reporting and payments and investments, liability management, all that stuff. And then 100% of the residuum can go back to the charity or charities that the donor was trying to give it to in the first place. So it's really just a giant pass through to be able to mitigate risk, have economies of scale and efficiency, but also being able to work with great donors who want to do gift annuities that otherwise may not be able to for their favorite charities. We're almost at 1,100 contracts now, so growing very, very quickly. And then probably half of our time, many of you know, is around the non-cash space. We do some direct consulting just on an hourly fee basis for charities to help them with either due diligence or management, receipt, sale. But by far, our activity is majority is around actually receiving these donations, just like the Gift Annuity Foundation, receiving them into our Decami Foundation or Decami Asset Trust, so that the charity is never on the chain of title. We are the charity on the chain of title, so we're the lightning rod. And then so we have then our due diligence process. We move very quickly. So average is about 3 days to complete a gift from initial conversation for business interests after we get all the due diligence documents. For real estate, it's about 5 to 7 days. For crypto, it might be a couple hours. So these are all gifts otherwise that the charity may not be comfortable taking on for whatever reason, legal tax reasons, capacity issues, it's December 15th, any kind of reason. We always say for everything we do, don't say no to a good donor wanting to do good things with a good asset. And you all know what a good donor is. You know what good things are. You know what a good asset is. Like, oh, be more specific. You know exactly what I mean. So rather than saying no, you can refer that over. We can then process that gift. We do a lot now in the charitable remainder trust space with illiquid gifts or also liquid, where we can serve as trustee. The key point for everything that we do is nothing stays with us once it's liquid for gift annuities, for charitable remainder trusts, or for our donor advised funds. Once there's liquidity, the donor has a standing grant recommendation for it to go back out again to the charity or charities they really want to maximize their impact for. And you can see there we're now over, it's not close to 5 billion, we're over 5 billion of completed donations. So very quickly, if Dan, you can maybe forward one. This is just our activity last year. Make a quick point about year to date. So this is just our non-cash activity. Not going to spend more than 30 seconds on this, but we received 287 donations. Those are completed donations. Typically, we get about 8 to 10 referrals a day. Only one completes. That's $640 million. Most importantly, 100% of the gifts that are referred to us were already declined by another charity. That's how we got the referral. So every one of these were initially declined and now sort of captured for the charitable space to maximize the donor's impact. You can see the breakdown between real estate, business interest, and so on. Quick call out, we're cryptocurrency, over $100 million last year, so a lot more than we've ever received in the past. Usually that was around 2% or less pretty consistently. My only quick comment now is year to date, we're at 152 donations, which is crazy strong. That's about 30% more than we've ever received in the first 6 months of the year. And we're about $550 million in assets, 30% more than we've ever received in the first 6 months of the year. So we'll exceed again well over $1 billion in donations for the year would be my forecast here. And it would be pretty similar to this same sort of ratio breakdown between real estate, business interest, crypto, and so on. So with that, we're talking about our donor advised fund, and I want to now hand it over to my friend, Dr. Dan Heist, done incredible work, both directly and as a team in the donor advised fund space. We have needed it so desperately for so long, and just so glad he was able to be with us today to walk us through donor advised funds, research, and help you learn a bit more about it. Quick housekeeping. You all know that have attended before. We will send out a recording next week. I'm not going to send slides. I love you to 300 people. I did that once. I'll never do that again. You know, I didn't get it. Send it to my home. Oh my God, a video's coming out. And two, any of your questions, please, we're going to have some time at the end. Please ask your questions in the Q&A. I'll answer some of those as I am able and feel comfortable. Anything else, I'll look at some themes for Dr. Heist to answer at the end. And many of you know we'll take the questions from today's webinar, the one from Thursdays, and then we'll have all the answers to those when we send out the video next week. So with that, now, Dr. Heist.
Thanks, Brian. This is a real pleasure for me to be with you and your group. Thank you for the invitation. And thank you to all of you for joining today. I spent about 9 years as a professional fundraiser, mostly in major gifts and a little bit of planned giving, and was always really grateful for webinars where I could learn something that would help me do my job better. So today my goal is to present to you research that we've done over the last 8 years that will help you facilitate philanthropy. And I think it's a really exciting time to be in the philanthropic sector. I think there's a lot of great innovation, a lot of great opportunity to grow, and frankly, there's great demand for private dollars and private donors to support the great work that many of you are involved in, and all of you are helping to facilitate. So again, I'm Dan Heist. I'm on the faculty at Brigham Young University out in Provo, Utah, and we'll be talking about donor advised funds today. Going to go over really just briefly a little bit of history, some regulations and policies, so that we can be aware of some of the sticky points a little bit when we're working with donor advised funds. Then I'm going to share some research around who's using donor advised funds. We've recently collected pretty good data on that and some survey data as well. We're going to talk about the patterns that we're seeing about how folks are using donor advised funds, and then we're going to spend some time at the end with questions. Just as a quick overview, really grateful to colleagues that I have all over the country. Dr. Vance McMullen at DePaul University, Jeff Williams at Grand Valley State, Rachel Sumption here at Brigham Young University. We've got Jen Shaker at Indiana, and others who have helped with this research over the last 7 to 8 years. So this is just a smattering of the kind of data that we've collected: 990 data, focus groups, interviews, 2 sets of in-depth interviews, management surveys, donor surveys, and then account records from 111 DAF sponsoring organizations all around the country. So that's a really nice data set that gives us really great insights. So what we're going to do today, just really briefly, I know probably most of you, if not all of you on the call, understand donor advised funds and how they work, but just want to set a baseline here. So donor advised funds start with a donor making a tax-deductible contribution into an account. Again, this can be non-cash assets, and if it's complex, call Brian and his team, and if it's tricky for you to handle, they can help you take that contribution in, and that is tax deductible to the donor immediately. Those assets are taken and they're managed by the DAF sponsoring organization, who is a 501c3 charity, and they can grow, and that growth can be granted out, is available for grant making. And then finally, the last step is that the donor advises that charity, that sponsoring organization, to then make grants out to organizations that he or she cares about. And so that's why it's called a donor advised fund. And so that's the basics of how a donor advised fund works. So we're going to get into there are some differences between different kinds of donor advised funds, different types of assets that different organizations are comfortable sharing, different minimums and fund sizes, investment options and fees. So there is some variation across this stage, but the basics remain the same across the sponsoring organizations. There are different kinds of organizations that sponsor donor advised funds. These are kind of the most common that we see. So we have national programs like National Philanthropic Trust that host a variety of organizations, donor advised funds. Typically, we'll also see organizations that are related to a financial services provider like a Vanguard or Fidelity or a Schwab. And the most common type of organization actually is community foundations. So there's over 600 community foundations out there that have donor advised funds for their clients or for their donors. And then there's kind of this other group that we call single issue charities, but the most common within the single issue charities by far are religiously affiliated organizations or faith-based organizations. So like a Jewish Federation or a Jewish Foundation. So we're also seeing some universities and hospitals get into that space as well. But this gives you kind of a lay of the land of the different types of organizations that sponsor donor advised funds. Just want to give you a little bit of a snapshot, even though we do have this variation in the types of organizations. As you can see on the left, the nationals, that dark orange, they're the smallest group by number. They're only about 6% percent of the roughly a little over 1,000 organizations that host them. But on the right, you'll see that they manage about 70% of the assets. So much larger organizations that are hosting a lot of accounts from a lot of people. So roughly speaking, there are about 2 million accounts out there. And so they host a lot of those accounts and a lot of those assets. The community foundations, as I mentioned, are the most common, so that they're kind of this light orange beige, and they manage about 24% of the assets. And then the single issue charities make up 30% of the organizations, and they host about 9% of the assets. So that gives you a sense of the lay of the land. I'm going to quickly go over a little bit of the history, but I think some of this is important to understand kind of where we got here, how this vehicle became really popular. Almost 100 years ago, we started seeing the first DAFs coming out of New York Community Trust, setting up these accounts where donors could continue to, have some say over how the funds were being used. Obviously, the Tax Reform Act of 1969 really codified private foundations and some rules and regulations to monitor and provide more accountability on private foundations. That's an important piece of the history because it kind of raised the regulatory environment around private foundations. So private philanthropy was a little bit more scrutinized, a little bit more costly to run in terms of hiring professional staff. And so eventually that's going to make donor advised funds be much more attractive to donors who want to still have some advisory role in their philanthropy, but are not wanting to kind of handle the institutional regulations for donor advised funds. Or sorry, institutional regulations for private foundations. Early 1990s is when we first see the first letter ruling. So Fidelity Investments approached the IRS and said, we'd like to set up our own charity where we can handle giving accounts. And they got clearance from the IRS to do that. So that's really where we see an inflection point in the history of donor advised funds, where we start seeing financial service organizations setting up their own charities or to start providing this vehicle to their clients. In 2006 is when we have the Pension Protection Act. This is when Congress says, okay, we're going to kind of codify this specific type of vehicle, this donor advised fund. So they've been around for a long time. Now it's actually in legislation, and that's when Congress asks all donor advised funds who are, all organizations that are hosting donor advised funds to start reporting on the 990, how many accounts they have, what are the assets that are in those accounts, how much is coming in, how much is going out every year. And so that's when we really first are able to start seeing data and collect data on a national level of that. In 2017, the IRS posted a notice that tried to clarify what it meant around personal benefits and also pledges. There continues to remain some gray area around what donor advised funds can and cannot be used for. 2021 is when some legislation was proposed to try and build more regulation around donor advised funds. That has not gone through, but some of the ideas that were floated in that proposal still remain today. Things like having maybe a sunset clause to how long the assets can last, possibly breaking up different types of donor advised funds based on asset size or the clients they serve. And then again, just recently, a couple of years ago, some proposed regulations from the IRS around how fees are charged from financial advisors that are managing assets inside it. Brian, you want to hop in real quick?
Yeah, appreciate that. Super quick too, which I think is funny on a couple levels. So I do a lot with community foundations as well. And so a lot of people, when they look at this, might think, oh, so community foundations started doing these DAFs very early after the New York Community Trust. So I did some work with the Winston-Salem Community Foundation, and they actually had some minutes from a board meeting, I think in the early 50s. And they were one of the other very early adopters of donor advised funds. And it was actually really funny to read minutes, which that you don't say that very often, because there's this huge debate saying we're like the rogue foundation because there's nothing in the tax code that said you could raise money from living donors for donor advised funds. There's nothing. And the Winston-Salem Foundation is like, but there's nothing that says you can't, so it's sort of that model. And so for years and years and years, there was complete ambiguity about whether or not you could raise money from living donors for DAFs, where most all community foundations were trust form, so almost all estate gifts. So it's not until 1977, took them 8 years to figure out what they passed in 1969, actually meant and then allowed community foundations to raise money from living donors, which is why roughly half of all the community foundations in the country were set up between 1977 and 1982, or they were file drawer community foundations and they had their first paid staff from 1977 to 1982. So it's just interesting how all that history mixes a little bit.
It's great. I'm really skipping quickly. We could spend a whole hour just talking about some of this. I'm currently involved in a project. Really grateful for sponsors that we're interviewing folks who have been in the industry for decades to really dig deep and understand how different institutions came to kind of develop their program. So more to come on that in terms of the more recent history of how DAFs became popular. But anyway, hopefully this just gives you a quick look in the past and see kind of some of the landmark pieces of how we arrived to today. It's no wonder that you all are here because these are becoming extremely popular. I apologize, this data is a little bit out of date. We've got some newer numbers, but the trend is obvious, right? The assets are growing, accounts are growing, the grants coming out of DAFs are growing, and so this vehicle continues to become very popular, will continue to grow into the future and continues to be a part of all of our day-to-day jobs. I do want to just highlight some what we've found is that as we've tried to understand regulations, so there are the regulations that are kind of federal regulations and legislation, but the industry itself also self-regulates. So an example of this is the Council on Foundations has kind of its own standard set of policies that it asks institutions that are hosting donor advised funds to have. So this is some examples of those national standards. I know that a lot of the national DAF sponsoring organizations kind of have their own way of sharing standard policies and regulations across themselves. So we do see, this is not the wild, wild west. This is not just the money is just out there and no one's doing anything with it. We actually see a lot of institutions that have their own regulations are trying to bake their values into those regulations so that this money is being used for philanthropy and is being used effectively. So just want to highlight here the Council on Foundations and there are others. One of the projects we did a few years ago is we took the 150 largest DAF sponsoring organizations in the country and we went onto their websites, we emailed them, we called them and we said, can you share with us your policy documents? And we went through all of those policy documents looking for some of the regulations that were standard across these organizations. And we found that roughly around 90% of all these organizations had inactive account policies, and I'll talk about what that means in a little bit, but basically that an account cannot just sit inactive for a certain amount of time. They also had, on average, actually, I'll just dive into that a little bit. On average, it was about 36 months was about the period that money could not sit there. Some were a lot faster, some were a little bit longer, but that was the average. And then it takes about 18 months to reactivate. So in theory, there really are rules and regulations within the sector that are trying to keep the money moving, keep the money being used for philanthropy. I'll just share this. This is a little schematic that kind of explains how inactive account policy might work. So you have a donor advised fund account that's being set up, that's being used for grant making, and then you have this first kind of time period. On average, it was about 36 months, where if nothing happens within that time, the sponsoring organization will contact the donor and will say, we noticed you haven't used your DAF in a while. We'd like you to start using it again, or we need to close it, or we'll do something else with it. And then they give that donor roughly about 18 months to start kind of reactivating that account. There's a few different things they could do. They could just they could close the fund, and then those funds will be used according to a succession plan, and we'll talk about that in a sec, they could start making grants. Or if there's a reason why they're not active, they could submit kind of an explanation and a proposal to keep the account alive. Maybe there's been some health issues, or they're planning to use it in the near future. So those are the things that would kind of reactivate an account. If that doesn't happen within those 18 months, then typically the sponsor will close the account. And we saw differences in the regulations at each sponsor. Sometimes a sponsor will have causes that they will promote or distribute the funds to. Sometimes they'll look at the donor's past history on what's been given in the past, and then they'll distribute according to that giving history. Sometimes there will already be some plan in place, and so they'll close the account according to that plan. And so that's how these inactive account policies work, and they're pretty common standard across the entire industry. Another thing that we saw as we looked into different policy documents and different organizations were that some organizations hosted what are called endowed DAFs. And an endowed DAF is like an endowment, but it's also kind of like a DAF. And the way that it works, about a little less than half of organizations offered this to their donors. The way it works is you set up a donor advised fund, and then there's actually a spending limit. So you can only grant out up to 5% a year. I think this is important for us to understand, because while there is kind of pressure, and there's kind of social norms around that money should be going out quickly, DAFs actually create a vehicle where the intent of the DAF is to promote long-term philanthropy and to sustainable philanthropy for a long time. So these endowed DAFs, there are roughly 9 or 10% of all DAFs are an endowed DAF. And so it's an important piece of the DAF ecosystem to understand that these endowed DAFs exist, and that they serve a very specific purpose, and that donors who use them, that there are policies in place for how the donors can use them. For all of you planned giving officers on the call, if you know that one of your donors has an endowed DAF, that's great news for you, because the remainder of that endowment will eventually go somewhere. And so great opportunity for you to speak with that donor about their succession plan, and if they can leave you a bequest or a gift out of that donor advised fund when they pass on. So I want to talk about that for a minute. Succession plan options. So as we looked at the various policies, we looked at what the options were for donors to use the money for when they pass on. So here are the 4 options that we came across in all those policy documents. The first and the most common were successor advisors. So allowing your children or grandchildren to come onto the account and to take over your advisory privileges, to be able to start using the account to do their own grant making. Roughly speaking, and I'll show you the next slide, about 70% of DAF accounts, that's their plan. And then the other options are they can, when the donor dies, a grant can be made directly to a charitable beneficiary, a charity maybe they've already been giving to throughout their lifetime. They could roll the money over into a pooled fund at the sponsor if the sponsor has an education fund or some sort of area of interest, that they could kind of make the grant over, just keep it within the organization. Say it's a community foundation or maybe a Jewish federation, they can keep it in that organization, just move it over into another pooled fund. Or some sponsors offered to roll the money into some sort of actual endowment, so a scholarship fund or something like that. So those are the options that we saw when donors were making decisions on what to do with what was left in their donor advised fund when they passed. We do have data on this. This is coming out of our large national study. So this is based on 57,000 accounts across 111 organizations. First of all, good news is almost all DAFs have some sort of plan in place. So over 90% of DAFs have a succession plan. Of those that have the succession plan, about 70% are planning to leave the DAF to individual family members as successor advisors. And then about 30% are planning to either leave it within the sponsor to some other purpose or to give it out to another charity outside of the sponsor. Hopefully this is helpful information. Again, for all you plan giving officers, this is a great opportunity for you to have conversations with the donors who support your organization and talk to them about their succession plans for their deaths. Okay, so let's hop into some data that we have on who's actually using DAFs. Not a huge surprise here on the age of donors. Baby boomers are the most common, the most common donors using donor advised funds. But we do see a bit of variation. We do see other generations engaging with donor advised funds. Sometimes there will be multiple generations on one account. So it is possible for someone to establish an account and then actually name their children and grandchildren while they're living to manage the account or to have advisory privileges. And so they don't have to wait until they pass on to bring the next gen onto the account and give them the authority to make grants out of the donor advised fund. But this roughly follows a lot of kind of major gift patterns for age. Some other demographics. Our survey was the first time that we were able to collect kind of gender and race and other demographics. We had some gender before, but roughly speaking, it's half and half, male female, in terms of gender of who's on the account. In the survey, we had about 2,000 survey responses all across the country. Grateful to all those who participated in that. We had 8% non-white, 1% Hispanic or Spanish or Latin origin, 61% retired, which was higher than we had anticipated. 35% attend religious services once a week. That tracks roughly with the general American population. And in terms of the sectors that they work in, there was much higher number of people who work in the nonprofit sector who were using donor advised funds. So 18% nonprofit sector is about twice as many as the normal American population. So and then self-employed too seem to be a little bit higher than normal. So people who are entrepreneurial, who had kind of closely held business assets seem to use DAFs more frequently. So that gives you a little bit of data. Here's some income. This is, again, first data that's really been collected on a large scale around the income levels of donor advised fund donors. So that, 200,000 to 500,000 range was the most common. When you ask around financial information on a survey like this, you kind of have to give big buckets or people feel a little bit uncomfortable answering your questions. So we had kind of broad bands of the ranges that we're asking on. So, but at least it gives us some idea of who's using donor advised funds. This next one is around their net worth. And so, again, in retrospect, I wish we had a little bit smaller buckets to get a better sense, but you can clearly see that, folks who have at least $1 million net worth are really kind of the ones who start using donor advised funds as a giving vehicle. And so, the next slide shows you how much is in the donor advised fund accounts. So this is a breakdown of the size of DAF. So again, this is 57,000 accounts all across the country. We think it's very representative data. Although I will note that we are missing some organizations who have zero minimums, and if we had those, or like workplace DAFs, so if we had those, there would be a much higher distribution on the left side, where with much smaller accounts. So I'll probably backtrack a little bit. It's not representative of all DAFs, but it's representative of kind of very common DAFs that are being used across the country. So, but again, one of the surprising findings coming out of this is half of the DAF accounts that we collected data on were less than 50,000. So it's not always huge accounts, huge amounts of money, but it definitely DAFs support what we would say kind of a mid-range of philanthropy. So it's more than checkbook giving, it's more than credit card giving. And it's a little bit less than your typical private foundations, and so it really kind of hits this sweet spot of the mid-range philanthropy. And so we think that DAFs really fit that space well. So one of the things that we are realizing as we collect data from donor advised fund donors is that they're using their DAF in conjunction with other types of giving. So very common for DAF donors to be giving out of in different ways, multi-pocketed giving. The most common is they're making direct gifts as well on the side, so cash, credit card, checkbook. But we also see quite a few donors also using their IRA rollovers. We see a little bit of a drop, after you get over 70, 72, 73, that we think that people are using their IRA a little bit more than their DAF. And so people are using also private foundations when using DAFs and direct stock gifts. So your DAF donor is giving in a lot of different ways. And so that's important to understand as you look at the patterns of their philanthropy. So let's look at some of those patterns and let's try and understand the various ways that donor advised funds are being used. I'll make one general note here. After 7, 8 years of studying donor advised funds, the thing that continues to impress me is just how versatile and how flexible of a vehicle they are. I touched on this a little bit as we covered the endowed DAFs, but you've got a wide range of philanthropy that's happening through donor advised funds. So it's a tool that can facilitate a really, really wide range of behavior and charitable giving behavior. And so it makes it exciting to study that because we see lots of different patterns. We'll start with some motivations. So we asked donors why they opened a donor advised fund. So again, this is for when they set up the account, what was motivating them. Clearly, they're thinking about tax advantages. Clearly, they're thinking about the ease of use of using this vehicle. And so as you work with clients, as you work with donors, just know that this is top of mind for them as they're setting up a donor advised fund. We see motivations actually shift once they've opened the donor advised fund, then they're using it to do grant making for other reasons, more charitably inclined. They already have their charities that they support, or they're already giving to charity and have those motivations. But these are the motivations for why they want to open a DAF. Investment potential is important. Streamlining their giving because a professional recommended it to them. So those are all important motivations. We looked at how often people add more money into their DAF, and on any given year, about 60% of DAF donors will add a little bit more. So this is not a set it and forget it. This is not a one-time type of vehicle. We see DAF donors coming back again and again, adding more money into the account. The bar chart on the bottom shows you a little bit of the frequency. So that darker brown is about 11% of accounts give every single year they're putting more money in. About 24%, most of the years in our data, they were doing something, maybe not every year, but most years. Another 26% had multiple years within the data set, but not less than half. Only about 20% had made one contribution to the data that we saw, and then another 20% had set up the account before we collected the data, and we didn't see any further contribution. So there is, maybe around 40% of folks who are less frequently adding, but 60% are pretty commonly adding money into the account. So for the financial advisors on the call, about 72% of the donors who answered our survey said that they do have a financial advisor or wealth advisor. And we asked them, okay, what advice do you ask them when using your DAF? And a little less than half, 44%, said that they ask what assets they should use to contribute into the DAF. A little less than a third, about 32%, said they ask the timing of when they should contribute into the DAF. And then just a little bit less than that asked about how much they should be contributing into the DAF. So we do see DAF donors using financial advisors for recommendations. It's not the majority, but it is a sizable portion of donors using DAFs. We also ask whether they are allowing the DAF sponsor themselves to manage the investments, or if they have an outside advisor who continues to manage the investments. And a little less than 10% had an outside financial advisor managing the assets within the DAF. So that helps us understand kind of the scope and the range of those advisors who are working with their clients to manage their charitable assets. This is a graph that I think shows some interesting insights into donor behavior. The orange line is money coming into a donor advised fund throughout the year. This is averages over several years, but it shows you a really clear pattern. This is no surprise to any fundraisers on the call or anyone familiar with giving cycles. You got that hockey stick kind of pattern at the year end where a lot of money is coming into the DAFs at year end. What's interesting to us is that kind of dark green, bluish line, that's money coming out of DAFs. And while there is a little bit of a kick at the end in year-end giving to charity, relatively speaking, the line is fairly flat. And so this is also good news for fundraisers because you can ask in April or you can ask in September, and for a donor, the calendar year, for a donor who has money in a donor advised fund, the calendar year is not as relevant. And so they're happy to make grants out of their DAF throughout the year. And so this frees up fundraisers a little bit to be making major gift asks, to be making solicitations throughout the year to their donor advised fund donors. They don't have to save everything for year end. In terms of where the money is going, this is coming out of Giving USA, ran a special report a few years ago. It's relatively similar to all charitable giving, although there is a little bit of a switch. When you look at all charitable giving, the most common source of all charitable giving is religion. It's roughly 30%. And then education is the next one down. In this data, those two switch. So education is the most common recipient of DAF grants, and then religion is the next one down. So we think that people are just giving to their places of worship more directly than they are through their DAF. Anonymity. We get a lot of people asking us about anonymity. We have 2.3 million grant transactions that we looked at, and we asked for each of those grant transactions that we identified which ones were completely anonymous, and only 3.7, less than 4% of all grant transactions were completely anonymous, meaning they had no identifiable information on the transaction on the grant. This is surprising to fundraisers, and we just did a series of interviews with professional fundraisers because I think kind of the feeling in the industry is it's very hard to get information about your donors. What's happening is very few grants are completely anonymous, but what will happen is a grant might come through with the name of the account of the DAF account, and whether or not that account has the donor's name or not, it varies. And so roughly speaking, about 70% of donors, 60-70% of donors will say that the name of their DAF account identifies them as well, or they'll have the name on it. But that's a little bit of a gray area. But this is kind of a baseline for completely anonymous giving. You can see that the average gift was a little bit higher for anonymous giving, although I will have to say that the median was the same. There were just a few outliers where we had some really big anonymous gifts that skewed that average. Payout rates. People also ask us about payout rates. There is kind of this aggregated payout rate that people often cite coming out of the National Philanthropic Trust annual report on DAFs that hovers around between 20 and 24%. What we do with our data is we break off into chunks. We're able to see each account and what the payout rate is out of each account. And so we show here that there's a wide range of payout rates. So the column all the way to the left is the zeros, and those are the ones who we didn't see any grants out of in the data that we had, but we also found that those were kind of newer accounts or smaller accounts, and that they either had just opened or they weren't doing a lot of grant making. But you can see there's kind of a wide range of payout rates. This is how long money stays in the account. So this is what we call the shelf life. Again, you can kind of see a wide range. I'll quickly talk you through this graph just as a matter of time. But the dark brown is that they haven't spent anything. So we call year zero the year it's opened. But again, if you remember money coming into the DAFs, a lot of that is happening in year end. So people are opening DAFs in December, and it's it goes without saying that they wouldn't have the time to actually start spending down the DAF that first year, that opening year, that year zero. But then as you move within year 1, 2, 3, and year 4 is really where we start to see the tipping point where most donor advised funds have spent at least all the money or most of the money. So this kind of mid-range color that is more than 50%. So by year 4, most DAFs have spent most of the money. And so you go all the way out to year 8, which is the end of our data, and you can see the percentages of the money being spent down out of the DAFs. In the last few minutes that we have before I pause for some questions and we start taking more questions, I want to share some insights that our team has had as we went out there and we interviewed DAF donors. We interviewed 48 DAF donors all over the country from a variety of organizations and a variety of regions across the country. And we sat down, we asked them, tell us about how you use your donor advised fund. Tell us about when you use it, why do you use it? And as we went through those interviews and we started looking at the things people were saying to us, one thing kind of surprised me is I didn't realize that there were some people out there that would put money into their DAF and then use it right away. They would just put in 100,000 and grant out 100,000. And I was talking with a colleague of mine at a community foundation in the Midwest, and I told him that. I said, we got people are telling us they just put money in and out. And he said, oh, yeah, that's our bathtub donors. And I said, bathtub donors, what do you mean your bathtub donors? That's kind of weird. And he said, yeah, they fill it and then they drain it, right? They fill it when they need it and they drain it when they're done. I said, oh, I kind of actually like that analogy. So I give credit to them for coming up with the bathtub idea. But we continued the analogy and we found that there were other patterns that people were using the DAF. So the next pattern was, typically this happened when they had a wealth event or some liquidity event. They would put a big chunk of money in the DAF and they would use it, but they wouldn't use it like all in one setting or all in like kind of one time. They would use it, it would be there kind of when they're ready to use it, and they would use it in the near future. We estimate about 2 to 10 years was kind of the idea. So it's like a water tank, right? It's there, it's ready when you need it. You're going to draw some down when you're ready, but then it'll be there for the immediate use, but you're not going to use all of it in one sitting. So that's our water tank donors, is they kind of use it like a holding tank. It's there, it's ready. And then we saw another pattern that was kind of interesting, where folks would really set up a DAF and they wanted it to be long-term. Remember those endowed DAFs that we talked about earlier? These are folks who say, my DAF, I want it to be long-term. They'll add a little bit to it. They'll use a little bit, but the bulk of it, they really want to keep that in place and use it for long-term. So I'm going to share just a few quotes with you that kind of exemplify these patterns that we saw. This is Kayla. That's not really her name and that's not really her picture, but this is really her quote. And for those fundraisers, no, I can't give you Kayla's email address. She's confidential, but she moves $5 million in and $5 million out every year. And she kind of has this goal where to kind of get under $1,000. So a lot of money moving through that DAF every year. And year in, year out, she's been doing it for a long time. But she's a bathtub donor, a tub donor, and she's filling it and draining it and filling it and draining it. Then we have Yael. Her and her husband sold a winery, sold a vineyard and a winery, and they put a bunch of money into the DAF. Hopefully hopefully they moved some of the vineyard into the DAF before the liquidity event, but I didn't get into the details there, but they put a bunch in and then they were going to use it in the near future. She said, maybe in a couple of years, maybe we're going to use it in a couple of years. They were still trying to figure out exactly how they were going to use all that money for a charity. But that's the idea of the tank donor. They're taking a little bit more time to figure it out, but they're going to use it soon. And then David had sold a business. He put about $2 million into the DAF. Again, Brian, I hope he transferred some of the interest of the business into the DAF before they sold. But he set himself up a budget. He said, I'm just going to create a budget. 5% a year. That's my budget. He did not use an endowed DAF, like an officially endowed DAF with an organization. He just created his own endowed DAF. He just made his own rules. And so he gives, he gives away roughly $100,000 a year. And he tells us, I want it to stay stable. I want it to even grow a little bit. And then he was going to pass it on to kids and grandkids when he died. So those are some patterns of things that we're seeing out of donor advised funds. Hopefully this data that we've shared with you has been helpful for you and your job and what you're doing to be able to work with your clients, work with your donors better. So I'm going to pause there and open it up for Q&A, and I could even stop sharing so we can see Brian better. There you go.
Sure. Fantastic job, as always. So I've got a couple themes I've been answering sort of as we've gone along here a little bit too. But maybe two themes have come up. One, Jim Murphy asks, first says hello, and curious about whether you think QCDs will ever be
Ooh.
allowed, sort of eligible distributions to DAFs.
Frankly, I'm hopeful on that. I do think it's. I know that there's folks working on proposed legislation to include DAFs as a QCD. I'll be honest, I have other colleagues that are more in the policy space than I am, but I don't know. I mean, hard to predict in this environment what future legislation will look like. But I'm hopeful. I think the reason I'm hopeful is not necessarily because I'm this kind of rah-rah pro-DAF, but because of the flexibility, right? Because it allows people to do charity in a lot of different ways. And so, and because the data shows that money is generally, being used in a timely manner. And so I think they're a very valuable tool to allow people to do philanthropy in a lot of ways. And so I hope that gives people more options. I think the more options people have to do philanthropy, the more philanthropy we'll see.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned sort of that there's sort of the flow through, and some questions came up around sort of why there are sort of any kind of inactive funds, sort of over time, sort of the reasons. I provided 4 or 5 reasons. I think a lot of other people on the webinar here might have other ones, so I've sort of included that. But I guess what would be your sense? And I saw some of the data that you had shared in terms of those that are inactive, over, let's say, like that 3-year period. Like what is that sort of real rough number? And I saw sort of how they were depleted in terms of the original contribution, but sometimes that gets a little funky versus prior contributions or earnings or things like that. But
sure. Yeah, so there's a couple things happening. This is definitely an area of research that we're actually doing more on now, that we really want to understand more. Roughly speaking, there's about 20% of DAFs within like a 3-year period that didn't do anything. When we looked really closely at those, and this is in the full report, and I can put up a slide later for our full report. They were generally smaller accounts. So, I think we categorized smaller as under 10,000 or under 5,000, exactly. And they were new. So they had recently opened within that 3-year period. And so that's one of the trends we're seeing. We do see some accounts, you kind of remember that flow chart, or that shelf life chart. At the bottom, there was kind of these dark ones that had kind of over 8 years and still had not spent anything. We're not sure on those. So more to come there. We think that some of those are folks who are kind of opening the account as like a holding place. Like they might put a couple $1,000 or $10,000, whatever, just to hold it so that they're ready when the private foundation's ready to spend down, or when, right? So it might be just, we're speculating at this point, but we're hoping to collect more data on those.
Yeah, and some are illiquid, just to throw that out there. We had a piece of real estate we held for 14 years. So you would say, oh, wait, there's no activity in a donor advised fund. Well, that's still a donor advised fund that's still reported on our 990, but there's nothing there yet. So
great.
Painfully. I don't want to lead you, so in all seriousness too, but I think that it's interesting from a policy discussion, and you can push back on this, but one is around the I would say that the general feel of direct service nonprofits around, DAFs are sort of between the donors and us, and if the DAFs weren't there, all the money would come to us, and there is some push by many around having sort of that sort of ACE Act type. Okay, you can get the whole policy theory is you get the deduction now, but the grants come out later. So why are you getting a deduction now when the impact is later?
for
And
sure.
my editorial, huge editorial thing is I was encouraged nonprofits to say, be very careful about what you wish for,
Yeah,
because getting a deduction now for the grants that come out later is literally every single endowment in this entire country. And like, oh, no, not our endowments. Like, it's the same thing. So I don't want to lead you there, but I guess any just sort of sense or commentary around this whole, private foundation, you set it up, you get the deduction now, you're sort of forced to sort of pull it out quickly, or DAF, others, and how that relates to every scholarship fund that exists, every endowment that exists, and other things that are very similar. So let me just,
for sure. No, I really appreciate that. That's something we think about a lot. Again, I have other colleagues like Dr. Vince McMullen that's a little bit more on the policy side. Um, I will just say this: Peter Frumkin has done some work looking at um, the history of private foundations, and after those regulations came in place. I think one of the things that concern us, or concern me at least personally, about more regulations is that it takes this tool that facilitates a wide range of giving from very quick to very slow,
Mhm.
and which is a lot of variation, a lot of heterogeneity, and it will homogenize. It will make everyone a lot more similar. And in my perspective, that would be a bad thing, because I think that wide range is actually good for the nonprofit sector. It does make it hard because you want to bring those bottom group up, but that might
Right.
mean you actually would anchor behavior and bring people down. So that's one thing. The other thing we've been really doing on our side is working with nonprofits, working with professional fundraisers. I'll drop a link to a report that we just came out. We are sponsored by the Association of Fundraising Professionals. We went out, we interviewed 46 professional fundraisers all around the country and said, how are you working with DAF donors? What's best practice? What are you doing that's working? And we put this report together. What we're realizing is that if we could do a better job on the fundraising side to understand DAFs, to connect with DAF donors, to speak their language, to understand the way that they're working, we can actually improve the grant making out of DAFs, I think, a lot quicker and in a
Mhm.
lot better
Yeah.
fashion than some rule, some law that's coming top down. I think if we get better as a sector to understand how to do fundraising better, I think that will move the needle more, or in a healthier way than a regulation. That's my own
Yep.
perspective. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. And then there's another one that sort of is the bathtub method helpful to the donor from a tax planning perspective, meaning doesn't the donor want to really have the money grow sort of tax free?
Yeah, that in our from the interviews we did with them, it's not. Um, there are some tax motivations. It becomes usually what they do is they have some appreciated security that they want to give to charity. They could do a bunch of wire transfers and stock transfers. It's the DAF really just simplifies that. So they are motivated by taxes, but the tax motivation is only on just being able to use those assets that are appreciated that they want to use. And then the DAF really just becomes a platform for them to be able to just do one stock transfer and then just send out a bunch of checks to the charities they want to support. So it's more about kind of just having a centralized platform to do that and having to do less stock transfers.
Yeah, and it's the bunching element, so which may was certainly under the new tax law may encourage even more of that, but certainly getting into the itemized deduction realm over the standard deduction, having that DAF be able to bunch in that 1 year, and we see this just constantly, which I'm interested that it sort of came out in your research is, I've got a private business, I've got crypto, I've got real estate, or I more often than not have publicly traded securities that I appreciate a lot. I want to go ahead and just move those over, take my big deduction in that year. I'm making it up. It's $500,000. And now I'm going to peel out $150,000 a year, just like boom, 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 boom. Okay, now I've got another deal that's coming up. I'll move that over. That is like textbook non-endowed DAF activity.
Yeah,
I mean, like
exactly.
textbook.
Yeah.
So I think it's less about necessarily having the tax benefits of tax-free growth, although they like that too, don't get me wrong. But I
Right.
think it's much more that front end push, be able to get that in, get that allocated in some way, reasonably relative to that, 20, 25% payouts ish. It is just what I see just sort of all the time, all things being equal.
Definitely.
Well, that was it on the questions. I was answering a lot. I will give everybody a little bit of confidence here that Dr. Heist will review my answers and will edit them, I'm sure, like all professors do with red pens and everything else. But we'll have the benefit of his insights there too. But so appreciate your moving through a lot of research that you've been working on for a lot of years. And I'm most excited about some of the future research questions that you're looking at now. There's just been such a need for thoughtful, and especially people, to be blunt, with fundraising backgrounds, sort of looking in this space and understanding the nuances of it as well. So thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
And we'll send again this video link out next week with all the Q&A from this session and next session too. So thanks, everybody. Good luck.
Thanks, everyone.